In February of 1964, something showed up at Daytona that NASCAR officials weren't ready for. It didn't look revolutionary at first. It was still cast iron, still a V8, still American muscle in the most traditional sense. The block was painted corporate blue. The valve covers looked massive but familiar. Nothing about it screamed, "This will change everything." But when the green flag dropped at the Daytona 500 that year, this engine didn't just win, it humiliated everyone else on the track. Richard Petty crossed the finish line first, piloting his Plymouth to victory with what seemed like effortless dominance. Then second place came in, and third, and fourth. By the time the dust settled, the top three finishing cars were all running the exact same power plant, the 426 HEMI. Plymouth swept the podium. Chrysler products occupied most of the top 10. Ford and Chevrolet teams watched helplessly as their carefully prepared race cars were left in the blue-tinted exhaust haze. The margin wasn't close, it wasn't competitive, it was embarrassing. And what happened next changed everything. Most people think the 426 HEMI became legendary because it won races. That's the simple version. The version that fits nicely into magazine articles and television documentaries. But the truth is much darker than that. This wasn't just an engine that beat the competition. It was an engine so powerful, it had to be banned. And the reason why comes down to one simple problem. It was never meant to survive. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to the early 1960s. NASCAR was transforming from a regional southern pastime into a national phenomenon. Television coverage was expanding, sponsorship money was flowing in, and the manufacturers realized something important. Winning on Sunday meant selling on Monday. The arms race had begun. Ford had its 427 FE, a monster of an engine with enough displacement to intimidate anyone who popped the hood. They were throwing money at their racing program like it was going out of style. Factory-backed teams, secret development facilities, engineers working around the clock. Chevrolet was pushing the 409 to its absolute limits with a 4.31-inch bore and a 3.50-inch stroke. Compression ratios were climbing past 11:1. Horsepower numbers were getting dangerously close to the 500 mark in race trim. Every manufacturer was following the same playbook. More cubic inches, more compression, more carburation, more RPM. But Chrysler engineers believed everyone else was solving the wrong problem. See? Traditional wedge-head engines, the design that dominated American automotive manufacturing, were struggling at high RPM. The combustion chamber shape forced air and fuel to navigate tight corners. Intake ports had to curve sharply to reach the valves. Exhaust gases bounced around before finding their way out. At 6,500, maybe 7,000 RPM, airflow inside the combustion chamber became chaotic. Flame fronts collided unpredictably. Detonation crept in at the worst possible moments. Valves started to float as springs couldn't keep up with the speed. Bearings began to suffer because the engine needed to rev higher and higher to make more power. And when you rev higher, everything starts to die faster. It's a simple equation. More revolutions means more stress. More stress means more wear. More wear means more catastrophic failures at the worst possible moments. But what if you didn't need RPM to make power? What if you could make the same horsepower at 6,000 RPM that competitors made at 7,500? That question haunted Chrysler's engineering team, and it led them deep into a design that most American manufacturers had abandoned years earlier. Hemispherical combustion chambers. The concept wasn't new. Hemispherical heads had appeared in racing engines before World War II. European manufacturers had experimented with them. Even Chrysler themselves had built the original 331 firepower HEMI back in 1951. But nobody had pushed the concept this far for stock car racing. The design was elegant in its brutality. Instead of placing both valves on one side of the combustion chamber at parallel angles, the hemispherical head positioned intake and exhaust valves on opposite sides of a dome-shaped chamber. With massive opposing valves placed at wide angles, sometimes exceeding 58 degrees included, the new 426 Hemi allowed for nearly straight-line airflow into and out of the cylinder. No tight turns, no choking, no turbulence robbing power. Just clean, violent air movement. The intake charge could flow almost directly into the cylinder. The exhaust could escape without bouncing off walls. The dome shape promoted complete combustion by allowing the flame front to expand evenly in all directions. With a gigantic 4.25-inch bore and a 3.75-inch stroke, the engine displaced exactly 426 cubic inches. That bore was massive, one of the largest in production engine history at the time, and that meant room for truly enormous valves. Intake valves measured a whopping 2.25 inches in diameter. Exhaust valves came in at 1.94 inches. Compare that to the competition's 2.0-inch intake valves, and you start to understand the advantage. It breathed like nothing else on Earth. In NASCAR trim, with 12.5.1 compression, forged steel crankshaft, and dual 4-barrel Carter AFB carburetors sitting on an aluminum cross-ram intake manifold, early race versions were making over 550 horsepower. Some whispered numbers even higher, 560, 570, numbers that seemed impossible, and nearly 490 lb-ft of torque at just 6,000 RPM. Which meant drivers didn't need to push the engine to 7,500 RPM like the competition. They could shift earlier, keep the engine in its power band longer, keep oil pressure stable, keep bearings alive. More importantly, they could pass other cars almost at will. When a Ford driver would wind his engine up to 7,200 RPM chasing a HEMI-powered car, he was destroying his engine. The Chrysler driver would just smile and pull away, his tachometer showing a relatively relaxed 6,400. Or at least, that was the theory, because there was a problem, a serious one. The very thing that made the 426 Hemi powerful also made it fragile. Those massive valves weighed more than conventional valves, significantly more. Every time the camshaft opened a valve, it had to accelerate that extra mass. Every time it closed, the spring had to decelerate it. The rocker arms were longer to accommodate the wide valve angles. That meant more mass in motion, more stress on the push rods, more opportunities for things to go wrong. The valve springs had to be stiffer just to keep everything under control. At lower RPM, this wasn't an issue. But as speeds climbed, those heavy valvetrain components began to fight back. At sustained high speeds, like the long straights at Daytona, where cars would hold wide-open throttle for nearly 45 seconds at a time, valve float would begin creeping in around 6,200 RPM. Valve float. Two simple words that describe something terrifying. When a valve spring can't close the valve fast enough, the valve floats open longer than the camshaft commanded. It might only be a few thousandths of an inch, a fraction of a millisecond. But inside a combustion chamber with a piston traveling at incredible speed, those margins mean everything. And when valve float started, pistons and valves began to dance dangerously close to each other. Mechanic Herb Knabb later described tearing down one early race motor after a session at Daytona. What he found still haunts engine builders today. Valve stems bent like paper clips, not cracked. Bent. The piston had contacted the valve so hard it physically deformed hardened steel. Pistons with crescent-shaped gouges carved into their crowns, metal fragments scattered inside the oil pan like shrapnel. We counted 9 separate piston-to-valve contacts, Knabb reportedly said. Engine still finished the race somehow. Don't ask me how. At 180 miles per hour, there's no such thing as a small failure. A thrown rod at those speeds could punch through the block, dump oil on the track, and trigger a multi-car accident. The Hemi was fast, but it was also a bomb waiting to explode. And then the real nightmare started. The oiling system. Every high-performance engine lives and dies by its lubrication. Without proper oil flow, bearings overheat. Metal surfaces weld themselves together, crankshafts seize, engines become very expensive paperweights. Unlike the later 427 Ford side oiler, which would address similar problems by feeding the crankshaft first, the early 426 HEMI fed oil through traditional internal passages that supplied the valvetrain first, and the crankshaft second. On paper, this made sense. The complex valvetrain with its heavy components needed lubrication to survive. But in practice, at sustained high RPM, it created a deadly hierarchy. The rocker arms and push rods got oil. The main bearings got whatever was left, which meant that at sustained high RPM, oil pressure to the main bearings dropped fast, dangerously fast. Drivers would come off turn 4 at Daytona, transitioning from the banking to the flat tri-oval, and watch their oil pressure gauge with white knuckles. Pressure falling from 60 psi to 50, then 40, then dipping below 30 in seconds. One engineer reportedly grabbed a driver by the shoulder before a race and told him, "If you see it drop below 30, pray you're near pit road." The driver didn't laugh, neither did the engineer. At the 1964 Daytona 500, several non-factory-backed teams blew engines before lap 100. One car reportedly lost oil pressure so quickly that the crankshaft seized mid-corner, locking the rear wheels and sending the vehicle into a spin. Another team watched their engine let go in a spectacular cloud of smoke and flame on the backstretch. The driver barely made it to the infield before the fire consumed the engine bay. Private teams were running the same basic 426 Hemi as the factory cars. Same displacement, same hemispherical heads, same basic architecture, but they were dying while Petty kept circling. Here's the crazy part. The factory-backed Hemis kept going. Chrysler had secretly reinforced the bottom end with cross-bolted main caps, extra bolts that clamped the main bearing caps to the block with significantly more force than standard 2-bolt configurations. They'd upgraded bearing materials to proprietary alloys that could survive momentary oil starvation. They'd modified oil passages in ways that weren't documented anywhere outside the factory racing shop. Private teams simply didn't have access to this technology. They were running production components against race-only parts that wouldn't be available for years. It wasn't just a power advantage. It was industrial espionage masquerading as fair competition. And that's when NASCAR realized what they were dealing with. By mid-season 1964, NASCAR officials had seen enough. The competition had been decimated. Attendance at Ford-dominated tracks was dropping. Sponsors were asking uncomfortable questions. Something had to be done. NASCAR issued a rule change requiring that all race engines must be available in production passenger cars. Homologation, they called it. If you wanted to race it, you had to sell it to the public. Chrysler hadn't sold a single street-legal 426 Hemi, not one. The engine existed only in race shops. It had never been offered in a Dodge Dart or Plymouth Fury. It had never appeared on an option sheet. As far as the public was concerned, it was pure fantasy, which meant the most dominant engine in NASCAR history was banned overnight. Chrysler was furious. They argued, they protested, they threatened to withdraw from racing entirely, and then they did exactly that. For the entire 1965 NASCAR season, Chrysler sat on the sidelines, refusing to compete under rules they considered unfair. But behind closed doors, engineers were working on a solution. So how do you make an illegal engine legal? You build 500 street versions. That was the homologation requirement. 500 units sold to the public through regular dealership channels. Prove that the engine was a production power plant, and you could race it again. Chrysler got to work. In 1966, Dodge and Plymouth released what would become known as the Street Hemi. Same 4.25-inch bore, same 3.75-inch stroke, same basic architecture that had dominated Daytona 2 years earlier. But there were changes. Compression dropped to 10.25.1 to survive pump gas. The race engines had run exotic aviation fuel and leaded racing blends. Street cars needed to function on whatever the local gas station was selling. The camshaft was tamer, still aggressive by production car standards, but not the race-only grind that sacrificed idle quality for top-end power. Horsepower was officially rated at 425 HP at 5,000 RPM, with a monstrous 490 lb-ft of torque at just 4,000. Those numbers were impressive, class-leading even, but they were lies. In reality, most dyno tests showed closer to 470 horsepower with stock equipment. Some touched 500 with simple bolt-on modifications. Chrysler had deliberately underrated the engine for insurance purposes. They'd seen what was coming and tried to preempt it. It didn't work, and transmissions weren't ready for this kind of power. Quarter-mile times in factory Dodge Chargers equipped with the 426 HEMI dipped into the low 13s at over 105 mph. Right off the showroom floor, no modifications, factory tires, factory exhaust, full interior. With slicks and open headers, test cars were running 11.8-second passes at nearly 118 miles. Factory cars, not purpose-built drag machines, cars that had been driven to the track. But the drivetrain was suffering. Drive shafts twisted under hard launches. The torque literally wound the steel tube like a spring before the rear wheels could react. Clutches burned through friction material in hundreds of miles rather than thousands. The massive torque spike overwhelmed the clamping force. Rear differentials cracked under launch torque. Ring and pinion gears that had survived years of normal service would shatter under HEMI power. You think you know what torquey feels like? Try 490 lb-ft hitting at 3,500 RPM. Try matting the throttle in second gear and feeling the entire car twist as the suspension loads up. Try explaining to your insurance company why your differential housing is now in 2 pieces. But speaking of insurance companies, they noticed. By 1968, premiums for HEMI-equipped vehicles were sometimes double that of standard V8 cars. The same Charger with a 318 might cost $400 per year to insure. With a HEMI, that number could exceed $1,000. Some companies outright refused coverage. Their actuaries had done the math. HEMI cars crashed more often. HEMI drivers drove more aggressively. The risk profile was simply unacceptable. The price tag didn't help either. At nearly $900 extra for the HEMI option, it cost almost half the price of the entire base vehicle in some configurations. A stripper Plymouth Roadrunner might list for $2,800. The HEMI option added $900. Suddenly, you were pushing $4,000 for a car with no air conditioning and a rubber floor mat. Only around 11,000 street HEMIs were ever built between 1966 and 1971. 11,000 cars over 6 model years. That's not a production run. That's a limited edition. And then, everything went wrong. The Clean Air Act of 1970 brought emissions regulations that high-compression engines simply couldn't meet. The federal government had decided that smog was unacceptable, and Detroit's horsepower wars were contributing to the problem. Suddenly, catalytic converters were mandated. Leaded fuel was being phased out. Lower compression ratios became necessary to prevent detonation on low-octane unleaded gasoline. Lower compression meant less power. That was simple physics. The thermal efficiency of an internal combustion engine depends partially on compression ratio. Reduce compression, and you reduce output. Retarding ignition timing, another emission strategy, meant less efficiency and even less power. Engines were being strangled from multiple directions simultaneously. Massive hemispherical combustion chambers made emissions control incredibly difficult. The large surface area and complex shape created challenges for proper flame propagation with lower octane fuels. By 1971, compression ratios dropped to 8.5.1 in many engines across the industry. But the HEMI couldn't survive like that. It was designed to make power through airflow and compression. Those were its two fundamental advantages. Take either away, and the magic disappeared. A low-compression Hemi would still flow air beautifully, but without compression to extract energy from that airflow, it became just another heavy, expensive V8. The economics no longer made sense. In 1971, Chrysler quietly ended 426 Hemi production. Tooling was scrapped. Blocks were melted down. The monster that once dominated Daytona vanished almost overnight. No farewell tour. No commemorative edition, no final celebration, just silence. So why do people still talk about it today? Because the 426 Hemi didn't just win races, it forced NASCAR to rewrite the rulebook. It created the homologation requirements that would shape stock car racing for decades. It established the principle that race cars had to have some connection to showroom vehicles. It pushed drivetrain technology to the breaking point. Transmission manufacturers had to develop stronger components just to survive behind HEMI power. Drive shaft designs improved. Differential technology advanced. It exposed how unprepared the entire industry was for real, usable torque, not theoretical horsepower that only appeared at 7,000 RPM. Torque that hit hard and early and never stopped pulling. And decades later, original Hemi-powered muscle cars would sell for over $1 million at auction. A 1971 Plymouth Cuda convertible with a Hemi sold for $3.5 million. Rusted Hulks with matching numbers Hemi engines have traded hands for six figures. Replicas exist. Modern Hemis exist. The current generation of Hellcat and Demon engines carry the Hemi name proudly, but none of them carry the same raw, dangerous intent. The original 426 Hemi was built in an era when safety regulations were suggestions, when engineers could pursue power without worrying about crash structures and pedestrian impact standards. It was built to win races at any cost, including, apparently, occasional catastrophic failure. The 426 Hemi wasn't just too powerful for its competition, it was too powerful for its time. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments what you want to see next. Another rivalry, another engine, or another forgotten piece of racing history. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the machines that defined American performance.